Jerusalem had never looked more glorious than it did in the 30th year of David's reign. The city that had once been a Jebusite stronghold, perched defiantly on its rocky ridge, had transformed into something its ancient inhabitants could never have imagined. Limestone walls gleamed white against the Judean hills, their surfaces still fresh from decades of continuous construction. The royal palace complex sprawled across the highest ground, its cedar beams imported from the forests of Lebanon, its courtyards paved with stones quarried from the valleys below. From its windows a man could see for miles the terraced hillsides descending toward the Kidron Valley, the scattered villages dotting the landscape like white seeds thrown across brown earth, and beyond them the shimmer of the wilderness stretching toward the salt sea. The king who gazed from those windows had travelled a distance far greater than the miles between Bethlehem and this throne room. David ben Jesse had been the 8th son of a shepherd, a boy so insignificant that his own father had forgotten to summon him when the prophet Samuel came calling. He had spent his youth in the rocky pastures outside Bethlehem, learning to read the weather in the movement of clouds, to find water in dry seasons, to protect his flock from lions and bears with nothing but a sling and a shepherd's staff. Those years had shaped something in him, a patience born from long nights under the stars, a courage forged in solitary combat with predators, and a faith refined in the silence of wilderness, places where only God seemed present. The transformation from shepherd to king had come through paths no one could have predicted. The boy who killed Goliath in the valley of Elah became the man who fled for his life from King Saul's jealous rage. The young warrior who united a band of outcasts and fugitives in the caves of Adullam became the military genius who conquered city after city. The exile who had once pretended madness before foreign kings to save his own life became the monarch before whom those same foreign kings now sent tribute and ambassadors. It was a story that seemed almost impossible in its sweep, yet here he sat, David son of Jesse, shepherd of Israel, king over a united nation that stretched from the border of Egypt to the banks of the Euphrates. The wars that had defined the first 2 decades of his reign had finally subsided. The Philistines, those ancient enemies who had once captured the Ark of God itself and dominated Israel's western plains, had been pushed back to their coastal cities and reduced to grudging submission. The Moabites to the east had been conquered, their fighting men decimated, their king now a vassal sending annual tribute of sheep and wool. The Ammonites, whose insult to David's ambassadors had sparked a brutal campaign, had seen their capital Rabbah fall and their iron crown placed on David's head. Even the Aramean kingdoms to the north, who had formed coalition after coalition against Israel, had been broken at Helam and forced to acknowledge David's supremacy. Peace had come to Jerusalem, and with peace came prosperity of a kind Israel had never known. The trade routes that crossed the ancient Near East now funneled their wealth through David's territory. Caravans carrying copper from the Arabah, incense from Arabia, and grain from Egypt paid tolls at Israelite checkpoints. The royal treasury swelled with gold, silver, and bronze, much of it dedicated for the temple that David dreamed of building, but which God had told him his son would construct. The standing army that had once survived on plunder, and the generosity of sympathetic farmers, now drew regular wages and trained in permanent garrisons. Skilled craftsmen from Tyre worked alongside Israelite builders to transform Jerusalem from a conquered fortress into a capital worthy of its king's ambitions. Yet for all its magnificence, this was a kingdom unlike any other in the ancient world, and David knew it. The empires that surrounded Israel operated on a simple principle. The king was supreme, answerable to no one, his word identical with law, his desires indistinguishable from the will of the gods. Pharaoh in Egypt was himself considered divine. The kings of Mesopotamia ruled as representatives of their patron deities, their authority absolute and unquestionable. But Israel had been founded on a different premise entirely, one that David understood in his bones even when he was tempted to forget it. The God who had called Abraham out of Ur and Moses out of Midian had established a covenant with his people that placed even kings under divine law. The book of Deuteronomy, which every Israelite king was commanded to copy with his own hand and study daily, made the arrangement explicit. The king must not acquire excessive horses, must not take many wives who would turn his heart away, must not accumulate vast quantities of silver and gold for himself. He was to be a brother among brothers, elevated to leadership but never above the law that bound all Israel. And to ensure that kings remembered their place, God raised up prophets, men and women who spoke not from royal appointment, but from divine commission, whose authority came not from the palace, but from heaven itself. It was into this unique arrangement that Nathan had stepped years before, when the kingdom was younger and David's reign still consolidating. The prophet had emerged from obscurity in the way that prophets often did, not through institutional channels or family connections, but through the undeniable weight of words that proved themselves true. Little is recorded of his origins. He was not, like Samuel, a child dedicated to the sanctuary from birth. He was not, like Elijah would be, a wild figure from the wilderness margins. Nathan appears in the biblical narrative already formed, already trusted, already moving in the circles of power with the quiet confidence of a man who knows exactly who sent him and why. The relationship between the king and the prophet had been forged in one of the most significant moments of David's reign. It happened after the Ark of the Covenant had finally been brought to Jerusalem, after the dancing in the streets and the sacrifices at the new tent shrine, after the kingdom had begun to feel stable for the first time. David had been sitting in his palace, that magnificent structure of cedar and stone, when a thought struck him with sudden force. He lived in a house of cedar, but the Ark of God dwelt in a tent. Surely this was wrong. Surely he should build a temple, a permanent dwelling place for the God who had given him everything. Nathan's initial response had been enthusiastic. "Go, do all that is in your heart," he had told the king, "for the Lord is with you." It was the natural answer, the expected answer, the answer any court prophet eager to please his monarch would give. But Nathan was not that kind of prophet. That very night, the word of the Lord came to him with a message that would reshape Israel's understanding of its future, and that would bind Nathan and David together in ways neither could have anticipated. The message Nathan carried back to the king the next morning was extraordinary. God did not want David to build him a house. Instead, God would build David a house, a dynasty. The son who would come from David's own body would build the temple, and God would establish that son's kingdom forever. "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me," Nathan declared, speaking words whose weight would echo through centuries. "Your throne will be established forever." It was an unconditional promise, a covenant of grace that asked nothing of David in return except to receive it, and it was Nathan who delivered it. From that day forward, the prophet occupied a unique position in David's court. He was not a hired spokesman who told the king what he wanted to hear. He was not an adversary looking for reasons to condemn. He was something rarer, a truth-teller who loved the king enough to bring him God's genuine words, whether those words brought comfort or challenge. David, for his part, seemed to understand the gift he'd been given. He welcomed Nathan's presence, sought his counsel, and treated him with the respect due to one who spoke for God. The relationship between them became one of the remarkable partnerships of the biblical narrative, a king who could still hear hard truths and a prophet willing to speak them. In these years of peace and prosperity, however, subtle changes had begun to work beneath the surface of David's soul. Success can erode what adversity builds. The shepherd boy who had trusted God against Goliath with nothing but a sling had become a king with armies at his command. The fugitive who had spared Saul's life twice because he would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed had become the anointed one himself, the man whose word could mean life or death for anyone in his realm. The young man who had written psalms of desperate dependence on God now wrote psalms of thanksgiving for victories already won. There is nothing wrong with gratitude, nothing sinful about enjoying the fruits of faithfulness. But somewhere in the transition from desperation to comfort, vigilance can quietly slip away. Nathan watched. That was part of what prophets did. They watched, and they waited, and they prayed for the wisdom to know when God was calling them to speak, and when he was calling them to remain silent. The prophet moved through the palace corridors with eyes that saw more than politics and administration. He noticed how David lingered longer in Jerusalem now, how the king who had once led every charge increasingly delegated military command to Joab and his officers. He observed the growing number of wives and concubines in the royal household, the accumulation that Deuteronomy had warned against. He sensed the almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere that comes when a man begins to believe his own success stories. Spring arrived in Jerusalem, the season when the winter rains ended and the roads dried enough for armies to march. In the ancient Near East, this was the time when kings went forth to battle, when the unfinished business of the previous campaign season was resumed, when rulers led their troops in person to inspire courage and claim glory. The Ammonite capital of Rabbah remained under siege, its walls still standing, its final conquest waiting to be achieved. It should have been David on the field with his men, David directing the assault, David accepting the surrender when it came. Instead, the king sent Joab. David remained in Jerusalem, walking the rooftops of his palace in the cool of the evening, gazing out over a city that had given him everything he ever wanted. The shepherd boy had become a man who no longer needed to fight his own battles, a king secure enough to let others do the dangerous work while he enjoyed the view from above. Nathan, somewhere in the city, continued to watch. The prophet could not have known what specific form the coming disaster would take. He could not have predicted the sequence of events that would soon unfold: the evening walk, the glimpse of a bathing woman, the series of choices that would spiral from temptation to adultery to conspiracy to murder. But men who walk closely with God develop a sensitivity to spiritual weather patterns. They learn to feel the pressure dropping before the storm arrives. Something was building in Jerusalem that spring, something as yet invisible to everyone except God himself. The king who had received so much was about to take what was not his. The man after God's own heart was about to break that heart in ways that would echo through generations. And when the moment came for truth to confront power, it would be Nathan, the quiet prophet, the bearer of both covenant promises and divine verdicts, who would walk into the throne room with words sharp enough to shatter a king. But that confrontation was still months away. For now the city basked in sunlight, the treasury filled with plunder from conquered nations, and the king of Israel rested in his palace while his armies fought his wars. The seeds of the kingdom's greatest crisis had been planted in the soil of its greatest success, and they were about to bear bitter fruit. The evening air had cooled enough to make the palace rooftop pleasant, and David walked its length as had become his habit in these idle spring days. Below him, Jerusalem prepared for night, cooking fires sending thin columns of smoke into the darkening sky, children being called in from the streets, the last merchants closing their stalls in the lower city. It was the hour when the world exhaled, when the day's business yielded to the quieter rhythms of home and rest. The king had no urgent matters requiring his attention. His generals handled the siege at Rabbah. His administrators managed the daily affairs of state. He was, for the first time in decades, a man with time on his hands and nowhere in particular to be. From the elevation of the palace roof, David could see into the courtyards of the houses below. This was not unusual. The king's residence occupied the highest ground in the city precisely because height meant security, visibility, and prestige. What he saw that evening, however, would set in motion a chain of events that no amount of royal power could undo. In a courtyard not far from the palace walls, a woman was bathing. The text of scripture handles the moment with striking economy. He saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. 2 sentences, no elaboration, no excuse-making, just the bare facts of what happened and what the king chose to do next. The woman's name was Bathsheba, and she was performing the ritual purification required of Israelite women after their monthly period. The timing matters theologically. It would later confirm beyond doubt that the child she conceived belonged to David and not to her husband. But in that moment, theological implications were far from the king's mind. He saw and he wanted, and he sent someone to find out who she was. The report that came back should have stopped him cold. She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Every element of that identification carried weight. Her father Eliam was one of David's 30 mighty men, the elite warriors who had fought beside him since the early days. Her husband Uriah was another of those 30, a soldier of such distinction that his name appeared on the roster of Israel's greatest heroes. This was not some anonymous woman from the lower city. This was the wife of one of David's most loyal officers, a man currently risking his life at Rabbah while his king remained safely in Jerusalem. The ties of loyalty, of military brotherhood, of simple human decency, all pointed in one direction. Look away. Forget what you saw. Let the moment pass. David sent messengers to bring her to the palace. The biblical text does not record Bathsheba's feelings, her words, or her consent. What it records is power in motion. David sent messengers to get her. The verb is significant, the same Hebrew word used when kings take cities or armies take plunder. When a king summons a subject to the palace, refusal is not a realistic option. Bathsheba came because she was called by the most powerful man in the nation, a man who had absolute authority over her husband's career, her family's standing, and her own future. Whatever happened in the royal chambers that night, it happened in the shadow of that imbalance. She returned to her house. The text moves on, and David apparently assumed the matter was finished. Weeks passed. The siege at Rabbah continued. Life in Jerusalem proceeded as normal. Then a message arrived at the palace. 4 words that changed everything. I am with child. The king who had conquered nations now faced a problem that military strategy could not solve. Bathsheba was pregnant. Her husband had been away at war for months. If the child was born, everyone would know it was not Uriah's. The scandal would be devastating. The man who had been anointed by God, who had received the promise of an eternal dynasty, who stood as the moral centre of his nation's identity, would be exposed as an adulterer who had violated another man's wife, while that man fought the king's own battles. David's response to this crisis revealed how far he had drifted from the shepherd boy who once trusted God with impossible situations. Instead of confession, he chose concealment. Instead of repentance, he chose manipulation. The plan seemed clever enough. David sent word to Joab at Rabbah, send Uriah the Hittite to Jerusalem. When the soldier arrived, David received him warmly, asking about the war, about Joab, about the progress of the siege. It was all performance, the king playing the role of concerned commander while maneuvering toward his actual goal. After the debriefing, David made his move. Go down to your house and wash your feet, he told Uriah. It was a euphemism, an invitation to go home and enjoy the comforts of married life. If Uriah slept with Bathsheba, the pregnancy could be attributed to this visit. The timeline would be close enough, the secret would be safe. David even sent a gift of food after Uriah, sweetening the suggestion, making the path home as appealing as possible. Then he waited for the report that would tell him his problem had been solved. The report never came. Uriah did not go home. Instead, he slept at the entrance to the palace with the king's servants, spending the night on stone floors when his own bed and his own wife waited just streets away. When David heard this the next morning, he summoned Uriah and asked him directly, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's answer exposed the chasm between his character and his king's. "The Ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents," the soldier replied, "and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." The words hung in the air between them. Uriah was speaking of honour, of solidarity with his brothers in arms, of the ancient warrior codes that bound fighting men together. He would not enjoy comfort while they endured hardship. He would not indulge in pleasure while they faced danger. He was also, without knowing it, speaking of the ritual purity expected during holy war. Warriors were to abstain from sexual relations during military campaigns as an act of consecration to God. Everything David had abandoned, Uriah embodied. The contrast was devastating. But David was not yet ready to abandon his scheme. He invited Uriah to stay another day, and that evening he got the soldier drunk. Surely wine would accomplish what suggestion had not. Surely intoxication would weaken those rigid principles and send Uriah stumbling home to Bathsheba. But even drunk, Uriah would not go to his house. He slept again with the servants at the palace entrance. His integrity was not a performance that alcohol could dissolve. It was the bedrock of who he was. 2 days of failed manipulation left David with a choice that should have been unthinkable. The righteous path was still available. He could confess his sin, accept the consequences, throw himself on God's mercy as he had done so many times before. He could trust that the God who had delivered him from Saul's spear and the Philistine armies could somehow deliver him from this disaster of his own making. But that path required something David was no longer willing to give: surrender of control, acceptance of exposure, trust in divine grace rather than human scheming. Instead, he chose murder. The letter David sent back with Uriah to Joab contained the soldier's own death sentence. Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. The king who had once refused to harm Saul because he was the Lord's anointed, now ordered the death of an innocent man to cover up an affair. The commander who had wept over fallen enemies and composed laments for those who died in battle, now coolly arranged for one of his best soldiers to be killed by deliberate tactical abandonment. Joab carried out the order. He was a practical man, a survivor who had navigated the bloody politics of David's rise and understood how power actually worked. The general knew what this letter meant. He now held knowledge that could destroy the king, but he also understood the transaction being offered, his complicity in exchange for continued favour, his silence purchased by shared guilt. He placed Uriah in the most dangerous position during the assault on Rabbah's walls. When the Ammonite defenders counterattacked, Uriah the Hittite fell. So did other Israelite soldiers, collateral damage in the king's cover-up, men whose names we do not know, but whose blood joined Uriah's in crying out from the ground. The messenger who brought news of the battle to Jerusalem had been carefully coached by Joab. He was to report the military setback, the ill-advised approach to the city walls, the casualties taken, and when the king's anger flared at the tactical stupidity of the assault, the messenger was to add one final detail. Also, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. Joab knew David well enough to predict exactly how the conversation would unfold. He knew that those words would transform royal fury into royal relief. David's response to the messenger revealed the depths of his moral collapse. Say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. It was the language of battlefield fatalism, the kind of thing commanders said to comfort grieving soldiers. Coming from David in this context, it was obscene, a pious-sounding platitude deployed to cover up murder. He was playing a role, speaking lines that sounded appropriate while knowing they were hollow to their core. When the period of mourning ended, David sent for Bathsheba and made her his wife. The problem had been solved. The pregnancy would now appear legitimate. A new wife quickly with child was cause for celebration, not scandal. The secret was safe, buried with Uriah in whatever grave the soldiers had dug for him outside Rabbah's walls. Jerusalem noticed nothing. The court continued its functions. The nation remained unaware that its greatest king had become an adulterer, a deceiver, and a murderer. But the final verse of the chapter in 2 Samuel pulls back to reveal what David had forgotten. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. God had seen everything. He had seen the evening walk on the rooftop. He had seen the messengers dispatched to bring Bathsheba. He had watched David's schemes to manipulate Uriah, had witnessed the letter written and sealed, had observed Joab positioning a loyal soldier for death. The darkness that hid David's actions from Jerusalem provided no cover from heaven. The secret that David had protected through manipulation and murder was no secret at all to the one whose opinion actually mattered. Months passed in this strange suspension. David went about his duties, administered his kingdom, perhaps even worshipped at the tabernacle and sang psalms of praise. Bathsheba's pregnancy progressed. The child was born. And still David did not confess, did not repent, did not acknowledge what he had done. Later the king would write words in Psalm 32 that seemed to describe this very period. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. If those words reflect David's experience during these months, then his external composure masked an internal torment. The silence he maintained before others could not silence his own conscience or escape the pressure of God's unspoken judgment. Somewhere in Jerusalem, a prophet waited. Nathan had not received word from God about what David had done, or if he had not yet received permission to speak. Prophetic timing was not a human decision. The message would come when God determined it should come, and not before. But whether Nathan knew the specifics or not, whether he had received divine revelation or simply sensed the spiritual weight pressing down on the palace, the time for confrontation was approaching. The king had sinned in secret. He had violated the commandments against adultery, against murder, against coveting his neighbour's wife. He had despised the word of the Lord, treating the divine law as something that applied to ordinary men but not to kings. He had taken what was not his, killed to keep it hidden, and settled into a life built on deception. The external circumstances of his reign remained impressive: the armies, the treasury, the building projects, the international respect. But at the foundation of it all lay a corpse and a lie. God's patience should not be mistaken for God's approval. The silence from heaven was not indifference, it was preparation. A message was being crafted, a confrontation designed, a moment chosen when the truth would finally break through the walls David had built around his guilt. The prophet who had once brought promises of an eternal dynasty would soon bring words of a different kind, words of exposure, of judgment, of consequences that no amount of royal power could prevent. The sword that would never depart from David's house was being forged in these very months of hidden sin and false peace. The king just did not know it yet. The word of the Lord came to Nathan. Scripture offers no details about when or how, whether it arrived in the stillness of night like the earlier revelation about David's dynasty, or whether it descended during the ordinary hours of day when the prophet might have been engaged in prayer or study, or the mundane tasks of life. What we know is that God spoke, and when God spoke to prophets, the weight of that speech was unlike anything else in human experience. It pressed down on the soul like a physical burden, demanding response, requiring action, refusing to be ignored or postponed indefinitely. The content of the revelation must have landed on Nathan like a blow. David, the king he had counseled for years, the man to whom he had delivered God's most magnificent promises, the ruler whose heart for God had seemed so genuine, had committed adultery with a soldier's wife, and then arranged that soldier's murder. The details were not ambiguous. God had seen everything, and now God was telling his prophet everything: the rooftop, the summons, the scheming, the letter, the battlefield betrayal, the comfortable marriage that followed, built on a foundation of blood and lies. Nathan learned it all, and learning it, he faced the terrible privilege of prophetic knowledge, knowing what others did not know, seeing what others could not see, and bearing alone the burden of that sight until God released him to speak. We cannot know exactly what Nathan felt in those first moments of revelation, but we can imagine the collision of emotions that must have torn through him. Grief, certainly. Grief for the David he thought he knew, for the king who had seemed so different from the proud and disobedient Saul, for the man who had danced before the ark with such abandon and composed psalms of such beauty. How could that man have done this? How could the shepherd boy who trusted God against Goliath have become a schemer who trusted manipulation against consequences? The David of Nathan's experience and the David of God's revelation seemed like two different people, and reconciling them must have been its own kind of anguish. There would have been anger too, righteous anger at the injustice done to Uriah, a man whose loyalty had been rewarded with death, whose wife had been taken, whose memory was now wrapped in lies. Nathan was a prophet, which meant he was attuned to justice in ways that ordinary people were not. The exploitation of power, the abuse of trust, the cold calculation that treated a faithful soldier as an inconvenient obstacle, these offences against God's moral order would have burned in Nathan's chest. Uriah had deserved better. Bathsheba had deserved better. Israel had deserved better from its king. But beneath the grief and anger, there would have been something else: fear. Nathan was being commissioned to confront the most powerful man in the nation with an accusation of capital crimes. Adultery and murder were both offences punishable by death under Israelite law. To accuse the king of such acts was to speak words that could be construed as treason, as an attack on the throne, as grounds for the prophet's own execution. David controlled the army, the courts, the apparatus of state power. If he chose to respond to Nathan's accusation with violence rather than repentance, there was no earthly force that could protect the prophet. Nathan would be walking into the throne room carrying truth as his only weapon, facing a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill in order to protect his secrets. The history of prophets who confronted kings was not encouraging. Moses had faced Pharaoh and barely escaped Egypt alive. Samuel had delivered God's rejection to Saul and then avoided the king for the rest of his life. In generations to come, prophets would face even worse. Elijah fleeing Jezebel's death threats, Jeremiah thrown into a cistern, Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, stoned to death in the temple courtyard at King Joash's command. The prophetic vocation was not a safe occupation. It demanded a willingness to speak regardless of personal cost, to value faithfulness to God above physical survival, to walk toward danger when every natural instinct screamed retreat. Nathan knew all of this. He knew the risks, felt the fear, understood what confrontation might cost him. And yet the word of the Lord had come, and prophets did not have the luxury of ignoring divine commands because those commands were dangerous. The same God who spoke the message would sustain the messenger, or if not sustain him, would receive him. Either way, the prophet's task was obedience. The outcomes belonged to God. But obedience did not mean recklessness, and Nathan faced a challenge that required more than raw courage. He needed wisdom. Simply walking into the throne room and announcing you committed adultery and murder might be true, but it would almost certainly fail to achieve God's purposes. David's defenses would snap into place. Denial, deflection, counter-accusation, the sophisticated self-justification that powerful people deploy when directly threatened. The king who had lived with his secret for months, who had perhaps rehearsed his rationalizations until they felt like truth, would not be pierced by a frontal assault. Nathan needed another approach, a way to slip past David's defenses before the king even knew he was under attack. The solution that emerged, whether from Nathan's own reflection or from direct divine instruction, was a parable. Stories had power that direct accusation lacked. They engaged the imagination, invited emotional investment, created identification with characters before the listener realized where the narrative was heading. A well-crafted story could lead a man to pronounce judgment on himself, to condemn actions he would defend if he recognized them as his own. Nathan would not accuse David, he would invite David to accuse himself. The parable Nathan crafted was a masterpiece of prophetic strategy. It would feature two men, one rich, one poor. The rich man would have flocks and herds in abundance, more than he could count, more than he could use, wealth beyond any reasonable need. The poor man would have almost nothing, just one small lamb, a single precious possession that meant everything to him. The contrast would be stark, designed to trigger David's sense of justice, his instinctive sympathy for the vulnerable, his shepherd's heart that still remembered what it meant to care for a single lamb. The lamb in Nathan's story would not be mere livestock. It would be described in terms of intimate relationship, eating from the poor man's table, drinking from his cup, sleeping in his arms, treated like a daughter rather than an animal. This detail was crucial. Nathan needed David to feel the lamb's value, to understand that its worth transcended economics, to recognize that taking it would be an act of personal violation rather than simple theft. The lamb was Bathsheba, of course, Uriah's one wife, cherished and beloved, while David had wives and concubines beyond counting. But David would not see that parallel until it was too late. The crime in the parable would be carefully chosen. When a traveller came to the rich man's house, the rich man would refuse to take from his own abundant flocks. Instead, he would seize the poor man's lamb, that one precious possession, that beloved companion, and slaughter it to feed his guest. It was theft compounded by cruelty, abundance refusing to share while poverty was stripped of everything. The injustice was obvious, outrageous, designed to trigger immediate moral condemnation from anyone who heard it. Nathan understood his audience. David had been a shepherd. He knew what lambs meant to poor men. David prided himself on justice. He saw himself as the defender of the weak against the powerful. David had a poet's heart. He would respond to the emotional texture of the story. And David, crucially, was still capable of moral outrage, at least when the sin in question belonged to someone else. The king who had blinded himself to his own crimes could still see clearly when those same crimes were dressed in different clothes and attributed to a stranger. Nathan would use David's remaining moral vision to illuminate the darkness David had chosen not to see. The preparation complete, the strategy chosen, Nathan faced the moment every prophet dreads, the walk toward confrontation. We do not know how long he waited between receiving the revelation and delivering it. Perhaps God specified the timing. Perhaps Nathan was left to discern the right moment through prayer and spiritual sensitivity. What we know is that eventually the waiting ended. The prophet rose, left whatever space had sheltered his preparation, and began moving toward the palace. The streets of Jerusalem would have looked the same as always: merchants hawking goods, children playing, soldiers patrolling, ordinary life proceeding in its ordinary rhythms. None of these people knew what Nathan knew. None of them understood that their king had blood on his hands, that the throne they respected rested on a hidden crime, that the prophet walking past them carried words that would reshape David's reign and Israel's future. Nathan moved through the city alone with his knowledge, isolated by the burden of truth that only he and God currently shared. The palace gates would have recognized him. Nathan was a known figure, a counselor with established access, a prophet whose presence in royal circles was unremarkable. Guards would have nodded him through. Servants would have directed him toward wherever the king was receiving visitors. The very ease of access made the mission more painful. Nathan was not storming hostile territory, but entering a place where he had always been welcome, carrying words that might end that welcome forever. Each step brought him closer to the confrontation. Each step was a choice renewed, a commitment maintained, a decision to keep, walking when everything in him might have wanted to turn back. The fear did not disappear simply because he had decided to obey. The grief did not evaporate because the strategy was sound. Nathan carried it all with him: the weight of the message, the pain of the knowledge, the uncertainty of the outcome. As he moved through corridors he'd walked many times before, toward a conversation unlike any they had ever had. Somewhere ahead David waited, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The king might have been reviewing reports, or meeting with officials, or simply enjoying the leisure that came with delegating warfare to subordinates. Whatever occupied his attention, in those final moments of ignorance, it was about to be interrupted by a story about a lamb, told by a prophet who loved him enough to wound him, in service of a God who loved him enough to expose him. The door to the throne room approached. Nathan paused, perhaps to pray one final time, perhaps simply to breathe, perhaps to fix in his mind the words he had so carefully prepared. Then the prophet of God stepped forward to do what prophets do, to speak truth where truth was unwelcome, to shine light into darkness that preferred to remain hidden, to offer the terrible gift of honesty to a king who had been lying to himself for far too long. The confrontation that would echo through millennia was about to begin. The throne room was not crowded that day. David sat in the posture of a king receiving counsel, perhaps expecting routine business, a legal dispute to adjudicate, a petition to consider, the ordinary affairs that occupied monarchs between wars. When Nathan entered, the king would have seen a familiar face, a trusted advisor, a man whose presence had always meant either divine encouragement or spiritual guidance. There was no reason for alarm. The prophet had come many times before, and those visits had brought some of the most treasured moments of David's reign. The promise of an eternal dynasty had come through this man's lips. Surely whatever Nathan brought today would be worthy of attention. Nathan approached the throne with the measured pace of a man who knows exactly what he is about to do. His face would have given nothing away. Prophets learn to contain their emotions when delivering difficult words, to let the message speak rather than their expressions. He offered the customary greetings, observed the protocols of court, and then, with the air of a man bringing a troubling matter for royal judgment, began to speak. There were two men in a certain town, Nathan said, one rich and the other poor. David leaned forward, perhaps unconsciously. Stories captured his attention in ways that abstract principles never could. He was a poet himself, a composer of narratives that gave shape to Israel's faith and history. When someone began a tale, the king listened with the ear of a fellow craftsman, alert to structure and detail, already anticipating where the narrative might lead. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, Nathan continued, his voice steady, unhurried. He was painting a picture, establishing the world of the story, letting David settle into the role of listener before the trap was sprung. The rich man's abundance was emphasized, not merely adequate flocks but vast ones, wealth beyond any practical need, the kind of prosperity that should have made a man generous rather than grasping. But the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. The contrast was immediate and stark. Against the rich man's countless animals stood a single lamb, and not just any lamb, one that had been purchased, saved for, acquired through whatever small surplus a poor man could scrape together. This was not inherited wealth or accumulated flocks. This was one precious possession, bought with sacrifice, treasured beyond its monetary value. Nathan let the detail land before continuing. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. The lamb was not livestock in this story, it was family. It had been raised alongside human children, growing as they grew, becoming part of the household's daily rhythm. David, who had spent his own youth raising lambs in the fields of Bethlehem, would have understood immediately. Some animals became more than animals. Some creatures earned a place in the heart that transcended their economic function. It shared his food, Nathan said, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. The intimacy intensified with each phrase. The lamb ate what the family ate, not scraps or separate provisions, but food from the same table. It drank from the man's own cup, an act of closeness that blurred the boundary between human and animal, and at night it slept in his arms, cradled like a child, warmed by human embrace. The poor man's lamb was not a possession. It was a beloved companion, a source of comfort, a living creature that had woven itself into the fabric of his life. It was like a daughter to him. Nathan paused after this line. The word hung in the air. Daughter. The lamb had become not merely a pet, but family, loved with the fierce tenderness that fathers feel for their children. To harm this lamb would not be theft, it would be violation. It would be tearing something precious from someone who had almost nothing else. The rich man's flocks were numbers. The poor man's lamb was a relationship. David was fully engaged now. The story had captured him exactly as Nathan intended. The king saw the poor man clearly, could probably imagine him, conjure his weathered face and work-worn hands, picture the lamb nestled against his chest at night. David's sense of justice was awakening, his instinct to protect the vulnerable stirring toward indignation. He waited for the crime he already sensed was coming. Now a traveller came to the rich man. The complication arrived. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was sacred duty. When travellers arrived, they were to be fed and sheltered, their needs met with generosity. A rich man with vast flocks should have welcomed such an opportunity to display his abundance, to slaughter a lamb from his countless sheep, and provide a feast worthy of his wealth. The obligation was clear. The resources were more than adequate. There was no tension here, unless the rich man chose to create one. But the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveller who had come to him. Nathan's voice carried a note of incredulity, an implied question. How could anyone with such abundance hesitate to share? The rich man's flocks stretched across hillsides, more animals than he could count, more wealth than he could ever use. Yet faced with the simple obligation of hospitality, he refused to diminish his own holdings by even a single animal. The refusal was irrational, grotesque, a window into a soul so twisted by greed that generosity had become impossible. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. The crime landed like a physical blow. David's expression changed. The listening posture gave way to something harder, something that flashed in his eyes and tightened his jaw. The rich man had not merely stolen. He had stolen the one thing that mattered most from someone who had almost nothing. He had reached past his own abundance to snatch away another man's only treasure. He had killed a creature that was like a daughter to satisfy an obligation he could have met 1,000 times over from his own resources. The injustice was breathtaking in its cruelty, its needlessness, its utter contempt for the poor man's humanity. David's anger burned hot. The Hebrew text uses a phrase that suggests his fury was kindled like fire, blazing up with an intensity that surprised even the king himself. This was not calculated judicial displeasure. This was visceral rage, the response of a man whose own sense of right and wrong had been violated by the story he had just heard. The rich man in Nathan's parable had offended everything David believed about justice, about compassion, about the responsibilities of those who had much toward those who had little. The king spoke with the authority of final judgment, his voice carrying the weight of royal decree. As surely as the Lord lives, The man who did this must die. It was the maximum sentence, the ultimate penalty, pronounced without hesitation or qualification. David invoked the Lord's name to seal his verdict. This was not mere opinion but sacred judgment, backed by the authority of Israel's God. The rich man deserved death. His crime was so heinous, his cruelty so inexcusable, that nothing less than his life could balance the scales of justice. But David was not finished. The king who had once been a shepherd, who knew the law's requirements for property crimes, added a second judgment. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. The fourfold restitution came from the Torah itself. Exodus specified this penalty for stealing and slaughtering another man's sheep. David knew the law and applied it precisely, but more than legal precision, his words revealed what truly outraged him. The rich man had no pity. It was not merely the theft, but the heartlessness, not just the crime, but the cruelty behind it. A man who could look at a poor neighbour's only lamb and take it without pity had forfeited his right to live among decent people. The verdict hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. David had spoken as king and judge, invoking God's name, pronouncing both death and restitution. He had condemned the rich man with every ounce of moral authority he possessed. He had revealed, in his passionate response, that he still knew the difference between right and wrong, still felt the pull of justice, still burned with indignation at cruelty and exploitation. He had also, without knowing it, pronounced judgment on himself. Nathan had stood silent through David's outburst, watching the king condemn the very sins he had committed, hearing the passion of a man who could see clearly when looking at others, but had gone blind when looking in the mirror. The moment had arrived. All the preparation, all the careful crafting of the parable, all the lonely walk to the palace, everything had led to this single instant when truth would finally break through the walls of self-deception. The prophet drew himself up. His eyes met the king's. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of divine authority, the unmistakable tone of a man delivering not his own words but God's. "You are the man." 4 words in English, 2 words in Hebrew, atahesh. The shortest sentence Nathan had spoken since entering the throne room, yet infinitely heavier than all the words of the parable combined. No elaboration was needed, no explanation was required. The mirror had been held up, and in one devastating instant David saw himself in the rich man's face. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the throne room had ever contained. It was not the respectful quiet of courtiers awaiting a royal word, nor the peaceful stillness of a room at rest. It was the silence of a world collapsing, of defences crumbling, of carefully constructed lies dissolving in the acid of truth. David sat frozen on his throne, the judge who had become the judged, the king who had pronounced his own death sentence without knowing it. "You are the man." Everything David had worked to hide was suddenly terribly visible. The rooftop evening, Bathsheba's summons, the failed manipulation of Uriah, the letter to Joab, the staged battlefield death, the convenient marriage that followed. Every secret David had buried beneath royal dignity and religious performance lay exposed in the light of 4 simple words. He was the rich man. He was the one with wives and concubines beyond counting who had reached out to take the one wife of a faithful soldier. He was the one who had shown no pity, who had stolen what he did not need, who had killed to cover what he had taken. Nathan stood firm as the truth did its work. The prophet who had walked toward this moment in fear now stood in it with the calm of a man who had delivered his message faithfully. Whatever came next, rage, denial, violence or repentance, Nathan had done what God had sent him to do. The word had been spoken. The king had been confronted. The rest was between David and God. The silence stretched on, seconds becoming an eternity, as David ben Jesse, king of Israel, conqueror of nations, man after God's own heart, sat with the wreckage of his self-image scattered at his feet. The man who had been blind could suddenly see, and what he saw was himself, in all his guilt and shame, reflected in a story about a lamb. The prophet waited, the king trembled, and the God who had orchestrated this confrontation watched to see what David would do with the truth that had finally found him. Nathan was not finished. The The identification of David as the guilty man was only the beginning. Now the prophet spoke with the full weight of divine authority, delivering a message that would echo through the rest of David's life and into the generations that followed. The words came not as Nathan's personal rebuke, but as direct speech from Israel's God, introduced with the formula that prophets used when they served as nothing more than vessels for the Almighty's voice. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." The phrase demanded absolute attention. This was not counsel to be considered or advice to be weighed. This was the Creator of the universe speaking through human lips, and every word carried the weight of eternal authority. David, still reeling from the exposure of his sins, now had to hear what God himself thought of what he had done. "I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul." The divine speech began not with accusation, but with reminder. God recounted his own generosity, his history of faithfulness to David, the gifts he had lavished on this shepherd boy from Bethlehem. The anointing had come through Samuel decades earlier, when David was still young, still unknown, still tending his father's sheep. God had chosen him then, marked him for greatness, set him on a path that would lead to the throne of Israel. And when Saul's jealousy had turned murderous, when the established king had hunted David through wilderness and wasteland, God had preserved him. Every narrow escape, every moment when death seemed certain but didn't come, all of it had been divine protection, God's hand shielding the man he had chosen. "I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah." The catalogue of gifts continued. David had inherited Saul's kingdom, his household, even his wives, a common ancient Near Eastern practice that symbolized the complete transfer of royal authority. The united monarchy of Israel and Judah, those 12 tribes that had so often fractured into rivalry and civil war, had been placed under David's rule. He had received a kingdom, a dynasty, international respect, military victory, and the promise of descendants who would reign forever. God had given and given and given. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. This line cut deeper than any accusation could have. God was not merely listing what he had provided, he was revealing that his generosity had no limit. If David had wanted more wives, more wealth, more territory, more honour, he had only to ask. The God who had already given so abundantly stood ready to give more still. David's sin was not the result of unmet needs or divine neglect. It was the choice of a man who had everything reaching out to take the one thing that wasn't his, not because he needed it, but because he wanted it, and believed he could. Now the accusation came, and it came with devastating precision. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" The verb struck like a hammer, despise. Not merely violate, not simply break, but despise. To treat with contempt, to regard as worthless, to value so little that disobedience felt like nothing. David had received God's law, knew God's commandments, understood what was required of Israel's king. And he had looked at those divine words and decided they did not apply to him. The commands against adultery, against murder, against coveting, David had set them aside as inconveniences, obstacles to be circumvented rather than boundaries to be respected. In doing so, he had revealed what he truly thought of God's word. Not much. "You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." The crimes were named plainly, without euphemism or softening. God saw through every layer of David's scheming. The letter to Joab, the tactical positioning, the enemy arrows that provided plausible deniability. In heaven's court, none of that mattered. David had killed Uriah. The Ammonite swords were merely the instrument. David's will was the cause. And having killed the husband, he had taken the wife, completing a sequence of sin that began with lust and ended with murder. Then came the consequences, and they were severe beyond anything David could have imagined. "Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." The judgment was permanent. The sword would never depart. Violence had entered David's household through his own choices, and violence would remain there for generations. The king who had arranged a soldier's death would watch violence claim his own children. The man who had broken another family would see his own family shattered. This was not arbitrary divine cruelty. It was the natural consequence of what David had planted. He had sown bloodshed, and bloodshed he would reap. The prophecy continued, growing more specific and more painful. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. The punishment fit the crime with terrible precision. David had taken another man's wife in secret, hidden from public view, concealed behind palace walls. God would ensure that David's own wives were taken publicly, in full view of the nation, with no possibility of concealment or denial. The exposure David had worked so hard to prevent would come anyway, magnified and multiplied, the private sin answered by public humiliation. What David had done to Uriah would be done to David, not by God's hand directly, but through the choices of others that God would permit and even use for his purposes. These words would find their fulfillment years later, when David's own son Absalom rebelled against him, seized Jerusalem, and pitched a tent on the palace roof, that same roof where David had first seen Bathsheba, and there, in full view of all Israel, slept with his father's concubines. This sexual violation that David had committed in secret would be answered by sexual violation in public, performed by his own child, in the very place where his sin had begun. The symmetry was devastating, the justice poetic in its horror. David listened to it all. The king who had commanded armies and conquered nations sat silent as the prophet enumerated the catastrophes that would unfold from his choices. The throne room that had witnessed so many royal pronouncements now heard pronouncements against the king himself, judgments from which there was no appeal, consequences that no amount of power or wealth could prevent. David's reign would continue, but it would never be the same. The golden years were over. What remained would be shadowed by the sword that would never depart. And yet, in the midst of this avalanche of judgment, something extraordinary happened. David spoke. His response consisted of just 5 words in Hebrew, 7 in English, but they may be the most important words he ever uttered. I have sinned against the Lord. No excuses, no qualifications, no attempts to minimize or rationalize or shift blame. David did not point to Bathsheba's beauty, or his own loneliness, or the pressures of kingship or the temptations that come with power. He did not argue that Uriah's death was Joab's doing, or that the battlefield was dangerous anyway, or that these things happen in war. He did not claim that his contributions to Israel outweighed his failures, or that his years of faithful service should earn him leniency. He simply confessed. He acknowledged what he had done, named it as sin, and recognized that his offense was ultimately against God himself. The contrast with Israel's first king could not have been sharper. When Samuel confronted Saul after his disobedience regarding the Amalekites, Saul's response had been a masterpiece of deflection. I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people. Even in confession, Saul was managing his image, worrying about his reputation, trying to salvage what he could of his public standing. David's confession contained none of that. He made no requests, offered no conditions, sought no face-saving arrangements. He simply admitted the truth and left himself in God's hands. Nathan's response came immediately, and it carried news that David had no right to expect. The Lord has taken away your sin, you are not going to die. 8 words that changed everything. In the legal framework of the Torah, both adultery and murder were capital offences. David himself had just pronounced death sentence on the rich man in the parable, his own unwitting self-condemnation. By every standard of justice, the king deserved to die for what he had done. Yet here was God's prophet declaring that death would not come, that the sin had been taken away, that mercy was being extended where judgment was deserved. This was grace, not cheap grace that pretended the sin didn't matter, but costly grace that acknowledged the full weight of the offence while still choosing forgiveness. God was not overlooking what David had done. The consequences would still unfold. The sword would still come, the public humiliation would still arrive, but David himself would live. The covenant promises would stand. The relationship, though wounded, would not be severed. The prophet delivered this news with whatever mixture of emotions must have filled his heart. Relief, perhaps, that his king would survive. Sorrow for the suffering still to come. Wonder at a mercy that defied human calculation. Nathan had walked into the palace not knowing whether he would walk out alive. Now he stood as witness to something rarer than royal confession. Divine forgiveness extended in real time, the Creator pardoning a creature who had despised his words and broken his commands. But grace did not mean the absence of all consequences. Nathan had one more message to deliver. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. The child Bathsheba had conceived, the baby whose existence had triggered David's desperate cover-up, whose birth had seemed to mark the successful conclusion of his scheme, would not survive. Innocent of any personal sin, the child would nevertheless bear the weight of his father's choices. It was not punishment transferred to the guiltless. It was consequence working itself out in the interconnected web of human existence, where the sins of one generation ripple into the next, where choices made in secret produce effects that spread far beyond what anyone intended. Nathan departed. The confrontation was over. The prophet had delivered every word God had given him, and now the silence he left behind was different from the silence that had preceded his coming. Before, David's silence had been the silence of concealment, of secrets maintained, of truth suppressed. Now it was the silence of exposure, of judgment received, of a man alone with the wreckage of what he had done and the mercy he did not deserve. What happened next in David's heart would eventually find expression in the words of Psalm 51, the great prayer of confession that has shaped the devotional life of believers for 3,000 years. Whether David composed it that very day or in the weeks that followed, the psalm captures what the confrontation had produced in him. Not mere regret at getting caught, not simple fear of consequences, but genuine contrition that went to the root of his being. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. The prayer began where all true repentance must begin, with an appeal not to one's own merit but to God's character. David did not ask for mercy because he deserved it. He asked because God was merciful. He did not claim rights, he threw himself on grace. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. The acknowledgement of guilt was complete. David was not minimizing or forgetting. The sin was always before me, a constant presence, an inescapable reality, something that could not be unseen once Nathan's words had opened his eyes. Against you, you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. This line has puzzled some readers. Had David not also sinned against Uriah, against Bathsheba, against the soldiers who died as collateral damage? Of course he had. But David understood something profound. All human sin is ultimately sin against God. The commands he had broken were God's commands. The image he had violated in Uriah was God's image. The covenant he had trampled was God's covenant. Every horizontal offence had a vertical dimension, and it was that vertical dimension that made sin truly sin rather than merely social inconvenience. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. The Hebrew word for create here is significant, bara, the same word used in Genesis 1 for God's creation of the heavens and earth. David was not asking for improvement or reform. He was asking for something only God could do, a new creation, a fundamental remaking of his inner being. The heart that had conceived adultery and murder needed more than adjustment. It needed to be created anew. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. David had watched this very thing happen to Saul. He had seen the first king lose God's presence, watched the Spirit depart, witnessed the slow disintegration that followed. Now he pleaded that the same fate would not be his. He would rather die than lose access to God, rather suffer any earthly consequence than be cut off from the divine presence that had been his refuge since youth. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. This was perhaps the most radical insight of all. David, who had established elaborate worship in Jerusalem, who had brought the ark to the capital with sacrifices and celebration, who understood better than most the importance of religious ritual. This David now recognized that what God most wanted could not be placed on any altar. It was not bulls or goats or grain offerings. It was brokenness. It was the shattered pride of a man who finally saw himself clearly and wept at what he saw. The days that followed Nathan's departure brought the fulfillment of the prophet's final word. The child born to Bathsheba fell ill. David, who had murdered to protect this pregnancy, now fasted and prayed and lay on the ground through the night, pleading with God for the baby's life. The servants watched their king prostrate himself in grief, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing to rise from the dust. For 7 days this continued, David clinging to hope even as the child weakened, petitioning God even when the answer seemed increasingly clear. On the 7th day, the child died. The servants were afraid to tell David, reasoning among themselves that if his grief had been this intense while the child lived, surely the news of death would destroy him entirely. They whispered in corners, unable to bring themselves to deliver the final blow. But David saw their behaviour, read their averted eyes and hushed voices, and understood. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "He is dead," they answered. What happened next astonished everyone who witnessed it. David rose from the ground. He washed, changed his clothes, went to the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he returned to his own house, asked for food, and ate. The servants, bewildered by this reversal, gathered the courage to ask what they could not understand. Why had he fasted and wept while the child lived, only to rise and eat when the child died? Should not his grief be greater now, not less? David's answer revealed a faith that had passed through the fire of judgment and emerged transformed. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. It was acceptance without resignation, grief without despair. David had pleaded his case with God, had hoped against hope for mercy, had exhausted every avenue of appeal. The answer had been no, and having received that answer, David did not rage against it or collapse beneath it. He accepted it as the word of a God who remained sovereign even when his decisions brought pain. The child could not return to David, but David would one day go to the child. There was hope even in this loss, faith even in this darkness. Nathan is not mentioned in these scenes of illness and death and grief. The prophet had delivered his message and withdrawn, leaving David to navigate the consequences with God alone. But surely Nathan heard what happened in the palace. Surely he knew of the king's 7-day vigil, the child's death, the strange worship that followed. And surely he saw in David's response something that confirmed what God already knew. This was still a man after God's own heart, not because he never sinned, but because when confronted with his sin, he did not harden himself against the truth. He broke, and in his breaking, he found a God who does not despise broken things. The sword that would never depart from David's house had claimed its first victim. Others would follow in the years ahead. Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, each death a fresh wound, each loss an echo of the night on the rooftop when David had chosen a path that led here. But the man who walked through these shadows was not the same man who had written that letter to Joab. He was a man who had been exposed, judged, forgiven, and transformed. He was a man who knew the taste of both divine severity and divine kindness. He was a man who had met Nathan in the throne room and discovered that the most painful truth can also be the most liberating gift. In the aftermath of confrontation and confession, life in the palace settled into something resembling normalcy. But it was a normalcy shadowed by what had been and what was yet to come. David returned to the work of governing. The siege at Rabbah concluded with Israel's victory, and the king himself travelled to the front lines to accept the surrender and claim the crown of the Ammonite king, a massive circlet of gold and precious stones that was placed on David's head as a symbol of conquest. The treasury swelled with plunder. The borders remained secure. To outside observers, the kingdom of Israel had never been stronger. But Nathan knew what others could not see. The sword that God had promised would never depart from David's house was not a metaphor. It was prophecy, and prophecy had a way of fulfilling itself in ways that felt both inevitable and devastating when they arrived. The prophet remained in Jerusalem through the years that followed, watching, praying, waiting for the next chapter of a story whose outline God had already revealed. The first tremor came from within David's own family, from the tangled relationships of a royal household where multiple wives meant multiple sons, and multiple sons meant competing claims and simmering rivalries. Amnon was David's firstborn, the natural heir to the throne, a young man who had inherited his father's passions without his father's conscience. Tamar was David's daughter by a different wife, beautiful and virtuous, beloved by her full brother Absalom. The dynamics of this blended family created proximity without boundaries, desire without restraint, and opportunity without oversight. What Amnon did to Tamar echoed his father's sin with sickening precision. He saw, he wanted, he took. But where David's crime had been concealed for months, Amnon's violence against his half-sister became known almost immediately. He lured Tamar to his chambers under pretense of illness, overpowered her despite her pleas and protests, and then, in a twist of cruelty that exceeded even the assault itself, despised her and threw her out, his supposed love revealed as nothing but lust that turned to hatred once satisfied. Tamar emerged from her brother's house with ashes on her head and her ornate robe torn, the public symbols of a devastation that could never be undone. David heard what had happened. The text says he was furious, but he did nothing. The king who had once executed swift justice, who had built his reputation on protecting the vulnerable and punishing the wicked, now sat paralyzed before the crimes of his own son. Perhaps he felt he had forfeited the moral authority to discipline. Perhaps the memory of his own sexual transgression silenced the rebuke that should have come. Perhaps the guilt that never fully left him, despite God's forgiveness, made him incapable of confronting in his son what he had once done himself. Whatever the reason, David's inaction created a vacuum that would soon be filled with blood. Absalom waited. For 2 full years he said nothing to Amnon, neither good nor bad, but his silence was not acceptance, it was calculation. The brother who had violated his sister would pay, and Absalom would be the one to collect. When the moment came, a sheep-shearing festival, wine flowing freely, Amnon relaxed and unsuspecting. Absalom's servants struck on their master's command. The firstborn prince of Israel fell dead among the festivities, and Absalom fled to the protection of his maternal grandfather's kingdom in Geshur. The sword had found its second victim in David's house. Nathan's prophecy was unfolding exactly as God had declared. David mourned for Amnon, the son who had dishonoured his daughter and paid for it with his life. He longed for Absalom, the son who had avenged that dishonour and now lived in exile beyond his reach. The palace that had once rung with the sounds of a growing dynasty now echoed with absence and grief. The king grew older, his hair greying, his steps slowing, his heart bearing wounds that time could not heal. The golden years were truly over. What remained was the long, painful working out of consequences that had begun on a rooftop years before. 3 years passed before Joab, ever the pragmatist, engineered Absalom's return to Jerusalem. But David's reception of his son was cold. Absalom was permitted to live in the city but forbidden from seeing his father's face. 2 more years of this half-exile followed, the prince living in the capital yet cut off from the king, present yet rejected, home yet homeless. The estrangement festered. Whatever love Absalom had once felt for his father curdled into resentment, and resentment began to dream of revolution. Nathan watched as the family disintegrated. The prophet who had announced judgment now witnessed its unfolding, each chapter more painful than the last. His role during these years is not recorded in detail. Scripture focuses on the political and military dimensions of the crisis, but prophets did not simply deliver oracles and disappear. They lived in the communities they served, prayed for the people they addressed, carried burdens that others could not see. Nathan would have observed Absalom's growing ambition, his systematic cultivation of popular support, his positioning of himself as the just ruler that his father had failed to be. The irony was bitter. Absalom presented himself as the defender of those denied justice, when his own father had once been exactly that before power and sin had compromised him. The rebellion, when it came, was devastating in its swiftness. Absalom raised the standard of revolt in Hebron, the very city where David had first been crowned king of Judah, and the tribes flocked to him with a speed that revealed how deeply David's support had eroded. The king who had once united Israel now fled Jerusalem with a handful of loyalists, crossing the Kidron Valley, ascending the Mount of Olives barefoot and weeping, a fugitive once again after decades on the throne. The wheel had turned full circle. The young man who had once fled Saul now fled his own son, and the palace he'd built became the headquarters of the one who sought to destroy him. It was during this flight that one of Nathan's prophecies found its most painful fulfillment. Absalom, having seized Jerusalem, sought counsel on how to make his break with David irrevocable. The advice he received was calculated for maximum symbolic impact. Take your father's concubines, the women he left behind to maintain the palace, and sleep with them publicly, so that all Israel will know you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils. A tent was pitched on the palace roof, that same roof where David had first seen Bathsheba, and there, in full view of the city, Absalom violated his father's wives. What David had done in secret, God had promised would be done to him in broad daylight. The words Nathan had spoken years earlier now materialized in horrifying specificity. The location was the same, the sin was the same. Only the roles had reversed, and the exposure David had escaped through murder now came upon him through his own son's ambition. The symmetry was perfect and terrible, a demonstration that God's words do not return empty, and that the consequences of sin have a way of finding us even when we think we have outrun them. The civil war that followed claimed thousands of lives, including ultimately Absalom himself, caught by his famous hair in the branches of an oak tree and killed by Joab, despite David's explicit orders to spare him. David's grief at the news of his son's death was so extreme that it threatened to alienate the very soldiers who had saved his throne. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" The cry of a father's broken heart echoed through the chamber where he had hidden himself to weep, and the victory that should have been celebrated became a day of mourning for an army that had risked everything for a king who seemed to wish they had lost. 3 sons now, the child of Bathsheba, Amnon, Absalom. The sword was carving its way through David's family with relentless precision, and still it was not finished. Through all of this, Nathan remained. The prophet who had confronted David in his sin now stood with him in his suffering, not to condemn further, not to remind the king of how this had all begun, but simply to be present as a man who had spoken truth and still loved the one he had wounded. This was the other side of prophetic ministry, the side less often celebrated. Not just the courage to confront, but the faithfulness to remain. Nathan had not delivered his message and departed forever. He had stayed, year after year, watching the prophecy unfold, sharing in the grief even as he understood its justice. The relationship between prophet and king had deepened through the crucible of confrontation. David knew that Nathan would tell him the truth regardless of cost. Nathan knew that David would receive the truth regardless of pain. This mutual trust, forged in the throne room years earlier, made Nathan something rare in the courts of ancient kings, an advisor who could not be bought, could not be intimidated, and would not tailor his words to please. Such men were invaluable precisely because they were incorruptible. As David's reign entered its final years, this trust would prove essential one more time. The king had grown old. His body failed to retain heat. Even piled blankets could not warm him. The question of succession, always lurking beneath the surface of polygamous royal households, now demanded resolution. David had promised Bathsheba, perhaps in the aftermath of their shared grief over their first child, perhaps as part of the restoration of their relationship, that her son Solomon would inherit the throne. But promises made in private chambers meant little when other princes had ambitions of their own. Adonijah, now David's oldest surviving son, saw his father's weakness as his opportunity. He was handsome, ambitious, and impatient. Without consulting David or receiving any designation as heir, he began to act as though the succession were already decided in his favour. He acquired chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him, the trappings of royalty, the visual assertion of a claim he had no right to make. He gathered supporters, Joab the general, Abiathar the priest, men of influence who saw which way they thought the wind was blowing and positioned themselves accordingly. What Adonijah did not have was Nathan. The prophet had not forgotten God's purposes for David's line, had not lost sight of the promises that extended beyond David's lifetime to the son who would build the temple and establish the throne forever. When Adonijah held a coronation feast at En Rogel, inviting his supporters while pointedly excluding Solomon, Nathan and others who might oppose him, the prophet recognized the moment for what it was: a coup in progress, a seizure of power that would set aside both David's wishes and God's plans. Nathan moved with the political sophistication that decades in royal courts had taught him. He did not simply burst into David's chamber with denunciations. Instead, he coordinated with Bathsheba, crafting an approach that would cut through the fog of the old king's weakness and force a decision before Adonijah's fait accompli became irreversible. Bathsheba would go first, remind David of his oath regarding Solomon, alert him to Adonijah's actions. Then Nathan would arrive, apparently independently, confirming her report and pressing for immediate action. The plan worked precisely as designed. Bathsheba entered the king's chamber, bowed before him, and delivered her message. "My lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it." She listed Adonijah's supporters, described the feast in progress, and confronted David with the stakes. "The eyes of all Israel are on you, to learn from you who will sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise, as soon as my lord the king is laid to rest with his ancestors, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals." While she was still speaking, Nathan arrived as though by coincidence. He bowed before the king and delivered his own account, adding details and urgency. "Have you, my lord the king, declared that Adonijah shall be king after you, and that he will sit on your throne? Today he has gone down and sacrificed great numbers of cattle, fattened calves, and sheep. He has invited all the king's sons, the commanders of the army, and Abiathar the priest. Right now they are eating and drinking with him and saying, 'Long live King Adonijah!' But me, your servant, and Zadok the priest, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon he did not invite." The questions Nathan posed were carefully framed to accomplish their purpose, without directly accusing the king of negligence. Is this something my lord the king has done without letting his servants know who should sit on the throne of my lord the king after him? The implication was clear. Either David had made a decision he hadn't shared, or someone was acting without his authority. Either way, action was required. David, roused from his lethargy by the combined weight of Bathsheba's plea and Nathan's confirmation, summoned the strength that still remained in him. He reaffirmed his oath to Bathsheba. "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." The orders that followed were decisive. Solomon was to ride on David's own mule, a powerful symbol of the royal designation, to Gihon, where Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet would anoint him king. The trumpet would sound, the people would shout, "Long live King Solomon," and the young man would return to sit on his father's throne. There would be no ambiguity, no competing claims, no opportunity for Adonijah's supporters to pretend they had acted in good faith. Nathan had done it again. The prophet who had confronted David at the height of his sin now protected David's legacy at the end of his life. The man who had spoken unwelcome truth about adultery and murder now spoke necessary truth about succession and legitimacy. His role had not been limited to that single dramatic moment in the throne room. It had extended across decades, through prosperity and crisis, through judgment and mercy, through the slow unfolding of consequences and the ongoing work of guidance. When the trumpet sounded at Gihon and the people shouted for Solomon, Adonijah's feast dissolved in panic. The would-be king's guests scattered, each man running to save himself from association with a failed coup. Adonijah himself fled to the altar, grasping its horns in the ancient gesture of sanctuary, pleading for his life from the brother he had tried to supplant. Solomon, showing the wisdom that would later become legendary, granted him conditional pardon. If he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. The succession had been secured. The dynasty would continue. The son of David and Bathsheba, the second son, born after the child of sin had died, would build the temple his father had dreamed of and sit on the throne God had promised would last forever. Nathan had played his part in making it happen, the final act of a prophetic ministry that had shaped Israel's history at every crucial turn. The prophet who had announced judgment had also preserved hope. The voice that had declared, "You are the man," had also ensured that the man's legacy would endure. Nathan understood something that lesser prophets might have missed. Divine discipline is not destruction. It is correction. It aims not at annihilation but at restoration, not at ending the story but at redeeming it. David had sinned grievously, and David had suffered grievously. But David's line continued, David's throne remained, and David's God proved faithful even when David himself had not been. The sword never departed from David's house, just as Nathan had prophesied. But neither did the promise, the covenant of an eternal dynasty, the assurance that David's descendants would reign, the thread of hope that would eventually lead to a stable in Bethlehem where another son of David would be born. Nathan had delivered both the judgment and the promise, and both proved true. That was the mystery of prophetic ministry, holding severity and kindness together, speaking truth that wounds and truth that heals, serving a God who disciplines those he loves, precisely because he loves them too much to leave them as they are. The biblical narrative does not record Nathan's death. Unlike Moses, whose burial place is described in detail, or Elijah, whose departure in a chariot of fire became the stuff of legend, Nathan simply fades from the text after Solomon's anointing. We know from the Book of Chronicles that he wrote historical records of David's reign, documents that helped preserve the memory of all that had happened, but the prophet himself slips away without fanfare, his work complete, his legacy secured in the consequences of his faithfulness. Perhaps there is something fitting in this quiet exit. Nathan had never sought prominence for its own sake. He had not cultivated a following or built an institution around his personality. He had simply spoken when God gave him words and remained silent when God did not. His identity was entirely bound up in his function. He was a voice, a vessel, a man through whom divine truth travelled into human situations. When the truth had been delivered and the situations had been addressed, what more was there to say about the messenger? The message was what mattered. The message would endure, and endure it has. 3,000 years after Nathan walked into David's throne room, his story continues to speak to anyone willing to listen. The parable of the rich man and the poor man's lamb has become one of the most recognized narratives in religious literature, taught in synagogues and churches, referenced in ethical discussions, invoked whenever the powerful exploit the vulnerable and need to be shown themselves in a mirror. The 4 words that followed, "You are the man," have entered the vocabulary of moral discourse, a shorthand for the moment when self-deception collapses and truth can no longer be evaded. But the story's power extends far beyond its usefulness as a cautionary tale about abuse of power. It speaks to something more fundamental about the human condition, our remarkable capacity for moral blindness regarding our own behaviour, even while we maintain clear vision of the same behaviour in others. David was not a hypocrite in the simple sense of someone who says one thing and knowingly does another. He was something more complex and more common, a man who had genuinely lost sight of himself, who had buried his sins so deep that he could condemn them in a parable without recognising them as his own. The rich man in Nathan's story was obviously evil. David the king was just doing what kings do. The disconnect was complete, and it required prophetic intervention to bridge it. This is why Nathan's approach matters as much as his message. A direct accusation might have triggered immediate defensiveness, the psychological walls slamming into place before the truth could penetrate. But a story invited engagement before it demanded confession. David condemned himself before he knew he was the defendant, pronounced sentence before he understood he was the criminal. By the time Nathan spoke those devastating words of identification, David's own moral judgment had already sealed the verdict. There was nowhere left to hide, no argument left to make, no defense that hadn't already been preemptively demolished by David's own passionate condemnation. The parable teaches that sometimes the most effective way to help someone see their sin is not to point at them, but to point at a mirror held at just the right angle. Confrontation need not be brutal to be effective. It can be crafted, strategic, designed to work with human psychology rather than simply overpower it. Nathan was not merely courageous, he was wise. His courage got him into the throne room. His wisdom ensured that his words would actually land. Yet for all the brilliance of Nathan's strategy, the outcome depended entirely on David's response. The same confrontation that produced repentance in David might have produced rage in another king. Saul, faced with Samuel's rebuke, had made excuses and sought to preserve his reputation. Other kings in Israel's history would respond to prophetic criticism with imprisonment, persecution, even execution. David could have done the same. He had the power to silence Nathan permanently, to bury this confrontation along with all his other secrets, to add one more body to the count that already included Uriah and the soldiers who died beside him. The prophet's life hung on the king's choice. David chose confession. In that choice, he revealed why he remained, despite everything, a man after God's own heart. The phrase has puzzled readers who focus only on David's sins. How could an adulterer and murderer be described in such terms? But the designation was never about moral perfection. It was about orientation, about the fundamental direction of a life, about what a man does when he is finally cornered by truth. Saul, when confronted, sought to manage consequences. David, when confronted, sought to restore relationship. The difference was everything. I have sinned against the Lord. 5 words that changed the trajectory of a life and a dynasty. They contained no qualifications, no explanations, no attempts to distribute blame or minimize damage. They were the words of a man who had stopped running, stopped hiding, stopped pretending. They were the words of surrender. Not to Nathan, not to public opinion, not to political necessity, but to God himself. David threw himself on mercy because mercy was his only hope, and in doing so, he discovered that mercy was sufficient. The aftermath of that confession has shaped the spiritual lives of countless generations. Psalm 51, born from David's broken heart, has become the template for repentance across religious traditions. Its language has been whispered in hospital rooms and prison cells, in monasteries and living rooms, wherever people have found themselves face to face with their own failures and desperate for a way back. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. These phrases have carried the weight of human guilt and divine grace for 3 millennia, because they emerge from a moment of genuine crisis and genuine resolution. David's story also teaches the hard truth that forgiveness does not eliminate consequences. The Lord took away David's sin. He did not take away the sword from David's house. Amnon still violated Tamar. Absalom still killed Amnon and later died himself, hanging from an oak tree while his father wept. The child of Bathsheba still died in infancy. The family that David had fractured through his choices remained fractured, the wounds healing slowly if at all. Grace is not a magic eraser that removes all traces of our failures. It is something both more modest and more profound. It is relationship preserved, future opened, hope maintained even in the midst of ongoing pain. David would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk with God. Nathan's legacy, then, is not simply that he confronted a king. It is that he demonstrated what faithful presence looks like across the full arc of a relationship. He delivered hard truth when hard truth was needed. He announced grace when grace was extended. He stood with David through the consequences, remaining in the court through years of family tragedy and political crisis. And when the time came to protect the succession, he acted with the same decisiveness he had shown in the throne room, using wisdom and influence to ensure that God's purposes would be fulfilled. He was not a one-moment prophet but a lifetime companion, not a single message but an ongoing ministry. The story invites us to consider who the Nathans are in our own lives, the people willing to tell us truths we would rather not hear, to hold up mirrors we would rather not look into, to love us enough to wound us when wounding is what we need. Such people are rare and precious. They require courage to speak and wisdom to speak well. They risk the relationship for the sake of the person, gambling that honesty will ultimately strengthen what flattery would slowly destroy. Most of us resist them when they come. If we are wise, we learn to thank them afterward. The story also invites us to consider whether we might be called to be Nathan for someone else, to speak truth into situations where truth is unwelcome, to love people enough to confront them, to serve as instruments of divine correction in a world that prefers comfortable lies. This is not a calling for the self-righteous, who confront because it makes them feel superior, or for the angry, who confront because it provides an outlet for their aggression. It is a calling for those who, like Nathan, grieve even as they speak, who would rather not have to deliver the message, who understand that the goal is not victory but restoration. Above all, the story points beyond itself to the God who stands behind both prophet and king, the one who sees what is hidden and refuses to let it remain hidden, who disciplines because he loves and restores because he is merciful. Nathan's "You are the man" was not the final word. The final word was God's, spoken through the same prophet. The Lord has taken away your sin. Judgment and mercy flowed from the same source, aimed at the same purpose, the healing of a man who had broken himself and others through his choices. In the end, this is a story about the possibility of redemption. Not cheap redemption that pretends the past didn't happen, but costly redemption that faces the past fully and finds a way forward anyway. David was never the same after Nathan's confrontation. He could not be. The man who had sinned so grievously and been forgiven so graciously could never again take that grace for granted, never again assume that his status protected him from accountability, never again forget that the God who had blessed him was also the God who saw him truly and loved him anyway. The throne room where Nathan spoke those words has long since crumbled to dust. The palace that David built has vanished beneath layers of subsequent construction and destruction. Jerusalem itself has been conquered and reconquered, burned and rebuilt, fought over by empires that did not exist when Nathan walked its streets. But the story survives. The confession survives. The psalm survives. And the truth at the centre of it all survives. That there is no pit so deep that God's grace cannot reach it. No sin so grievous that it cannot be forgiven. No life so broken that it cannot be restored. Nathan knew this. He walked into the throne room carrying judgment, but he walked out having delivered mercy. He spoke the hardest words David would ever hear, and in doing so, he gave David the greatest gift David would ever receive, the chance to stop pretending and start healing. "You are the man" was not a condemnation. It was an invitation to stop hiding, to stop running, to stop building elaborate structures of deception and simply come home. David accepted that invitation, and though the road home was long and painful, he found at the end of it a God who had never stopped waiting. That same invitation echoes still, spoken by the spiritual, descendants of Nathan to all who have ears to hear. Come out of hiding. Face what you have done. Discover that the truth you feared would destroy you is actually the only thing that can set you free. The prophet's words endure because the human condition endures, and so does the mercy of God.